Every day, your mind creates elaborate stories about why you're not good enough, why things will go wrong, and why you're fundamentally broken. These aren't truths, they're cognitive distortions. And tonight, we're going to expose every single one of them. So grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let's rewire your brain while you sleep. This is Cognitive Distortions to Fall Asleep To. 1. All or nothing thinking, also known as black and white thinking or dichotomous thinking, represents one of the most fundamental and pervasive cognitive distortions in human psychology. This thinking pattern involves viewing situations, people, and experiences in absolute terms without recognizing the vast spectrum of possibilities that exist between extremes. Individuals caught in this distortion see the world through a binary lens where everything is either perfect or completely worthless, successful or total failure, good or evil, with no middle ground acknowledged. The psychological roots of all or nothing thinking often trace back to early developmental experiences, where rigid standards were imposed, criticism was harsh, or emotional safety was conditional upon meeting unrealistic expectations. Children who grow up in environments where perfectionism is demanded or way of, and acceptance are contingent upon, achievement often internalize these binary evaluative systems. The developing mind, seeking predictability and control, adopts these simplistic categorizations as a way to navigate complex emotional and social landscapes. This distortion manifests in numerous ways across different life domains. In academic or professional settings, a person might view themselves as either brilliant or stupid based on a single test score or project outcome. A student who typically earns A's might receive a B+ and conclude they're academically incompetent, completely dismissing their overall track record of success. Similarly, in relationships, someone might interpret a partner as momentary irritation, as evidence that the relationship is fundamentally flawed and doomed to fail. The emotional consequences of all or nothing thinking are profound and far-reaching. This distortion creates an internal world of extreme emotional volatility, where self-worth fluctuates dramatically based on momentary performances or outcomes. When standards are impossibly high and no middle ground exists, the inevitable result is frequent feelings of failure, inadequacy, and despair. The person becomes trapped in a cycle where they either feel euphoric about their perfection or devastated by their perceived complete failure. Behaviorally, all or nothing thinking often leads to paralysis or extreme reactions. Fear of imperfection can result in procrastination, avoidance, or complete abandonment of goals and projects. Alternatively, it might drive compulsive perfectionism, where individuals exhaust themselves trying to meet impossible standards. In relationships, this distortion can manifest as either idealizing others to an unrealistic degree or completely devaluing them based on single incidents or perceived flaws. The cognitive mechanisms underlying this distortion involve several psychological processes. First, there is a tendency toward cognitive rigidity, where the mind resists the complexity and ambiguity that characterize most real-world situations. The brain, seeking efficiency and predictability, defaults to simplified categorizations that reduce cognitive load but sacrifice accuracy. Additionally, selective attention plays a role, where individuals focus exclusively on information that confirms their extreme evaluations while filtering out contradictory evidence. Treatment approaches for all or nothing thinking typically involve cognitive restructuring techniques that help individuals recognize and challenge these binary thought patterns. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs methods such as examining evidence for and against extreme beliefs, developing more balanced and nuanced perspectives, and practicing flexibility in evaluation. Therapists might use scaling techniques where clients learn to rate experiences on a continuum rather than in absolute terms. Mindfulness-based interventions also prove effective by helping individuals observe their thoughts without immediately accepting them as truth. By developing the capacity to notice when all or nothing thinking arises, people can create space between themselves and their thoughts, allowing for more flexible responses. Dialectical behavior therapy specifically addresses this distortion through its emphasis on dialectical thinking, the ability to hold two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. Recovery from all-or-nothing thinking involves developing what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt thinking patterns to fit the complexity of real situations. This includes learning to tolerate uncertainty, accept imperfection, and recognize that most experiences fall somewhere along a continuum rather than at extreme endpoints. Individuals learn to ask themselves questions like, what evidence supports this extreme view? And what would be a more balanced way to look at this situation? The process of overcoming this distortion often requires confronting underlying beliefs about self-worth, perfectionism, and control. Many people discover that their all-or-nothing thinking stems from deeper fears about not being good enough or losing control over their lives. Therapeutic work typically involves exploring these underlying schemas and developing more compassionate and realistic self-concepts. Practical strategies for managing all-or-nothing thinking include keeping thought records to identify patterns, practicing self-compassion when imperfection occurs, and actively seeking out the gray areas in situations. Individuals learn to celebrate progress rather than demanding perfection and to view setbacks as learning opportunities rather than evidence of fundamental failure. 2. Catastrophizing represents a cognitive distortion where individuals consistently focus on the worst possible outcomes of situations, magnifying both the likelihood and severity of negative events. This thinking pattern involves a two-step process. First, imagining that something terrible will happen, and second, believing that the imagined catastrophe would be absolutely unbearable. People who catastrophize often find themselves trapped in spirals of what-if thinking, where they mentally rehearse disasters that have little probability of occurring. The psychological foundation of catastrophizing often emerges from early experiences with unpredictable or traumatic events. Children who grow up in chaotic or dangerous environments may develop hypervigilance as a survival mechanism, constantly scanning for potential threats. This adaptive response can become maladaptive when it persists into adulthood, causing individuals to perceive danger and disaster in relatively benign situations. Additionally, those who have experienced significant losses or traumas may develop catastrophic thinking as a way to maintain a sense of control. If they can predict and prepare for the worst, perhaps they can prevent it. Catastrophizing manifests differently across various life domains. In health contexts, a person might interpret a minor headache as a sign of a brain tumor, or a skipped heartbeat as evidence of impending cardiac arrest. In social situations, someone might catastrophize about a friend's delayed response to a text message, immediately concluding that the friendship is over and they'll end up completely alone. In professional settings, a minor mistake might be interpreted as career-ending, leading to predictions of job loss, financial ruin, and social humiliation. The emotional impact of catastrophizing is severe and multifaceted. This distortion creates chronic anxiety, as individuals live in a constant state of anticipatory dread about future disasters. The persistent focus on worst-case scenarios generates intense fear, helplessness, and despair. People become emotionally exhausted from the constant mental rehearsal of catastrophes, leading to decreased resilience and coping capacity when actual challenges arise. The emotional volatility created by catastrophizing can strain relationships and interfere with daily functioning. Behaviorally, catastrophizing often leads to avoidance patterns where individuals limit their activities to prevent imagined disasters. They might avoid social gatherings for fear of rejection, refuse medical checkups to avoid discovering illness, or decline opportunities for advancement to prevent potential failure. This avoidance, while temporarily reducing anxiety, ultimately reinforces the catastrophic thinking by preventing individuals from gathering evidence that challenges their fears. The cognitive mechanisms underlying catastrophizing involve several psychological processes. Probability overestimation occurs when individuals assign unrealistically high likelihood to negative events. Severity overestimation involves magnifying the impact of potential negative outcomes beyond realistic proportions. Temporal distortion plays a role, where the imagined catastrophe feels imminent, even when it's actually quite distant or unlikely. Additionally, catastrophic thinking often involves a form of tunnel vision, where individuals focus exclusively on negative possibilities while ignoring positive or neutral outcomes. Neurobiologically, catastrophizing appears to involve overactivation of the amygdala and insufficient regulation from the prefrontal cortex. This creates a state where emotional reactivity dominates logical analysis, making it difficult to accurately assess risk and probability. The stress response system becomes chronically activated, leading to physical symptoms such as muscle tension, insomnia, and digestive issues. Treatment approaches for catastrophizing typically involve cognitive restructuring techniques that help individuals develop more realistic assessments of probability and severity. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs methods such as examining evidence for catastrophic predictions, developing alternative explanations for situations, and conducting behavioral experiments to test feared outcomes. Therapists might use techniques like the downward arrow method to identify the specific feared consequences and then systematically examine their likelihood and manageability. Exposure therapy can be particularly effective for catastrophizing, as it allows individuals to gradually confront feared situations and discover that their catastrophic predictions don't materialize. This provides concrete evidence that challenges the distorted thinking patterns. Mindfulness-based interventions help individuals observe catastrophic thoughts without becoming overwhelmed by them, creating psychological distance from the content of their fears. Recovery from catastrophizing involves developing what psychologists call realistic optimism, the ability to acknowledge potential challenges while maintaining confidence in one's ability to cope. This includes learning to distinguish between productive problem-solving and unproductive worry, developing tolerance for uncertainty, and building confidence in one's resilience and coping resources. Practical strategies for managing catastrophizing include creating worry time, where catastrophic thoughts are scheduled for specific periods rather than dominating daily life, practicing relaxation techniques to manage the physical symptoms of anxiety, and developing coping statements that remind individuals of their ability to handle challenges. Many people find it helpful to keep a worry log where they record their catastrophic predictions and later note what actually happened, providing concrete evidence of the distortion's inaccuracy. 3. Mental filter represents a cognitive distortion where individuals selectively focus on negative details while filtering out positive or neutral information, creating a distorted perception of reality based on limited negative evidence. This thinking pattern is like wearing sunglasses that only let through dark light. The person sees their world through a lens that emphasizes problems, failures, and disappointments while minimizing or completely ignoring successes, positive feedback, and neutral experiences. The psychological origins of mental filtering often stem from early experiences with criticism, rejection, or emotional invalidation. Children who grow up in environments where their mistakes are heavily emphasized while their successes are ignored or minimized may develop this selective attention pattern as a way to anticipate and prepare for criticism. Additionally, individuals who have experienced depression or anxiety may develop mental filtering as both a symptom and a maintaining factor of their condition. The negative focus reinforces negative mood states, which in turn strengthens the filtering process. Mental filtering manifests in various ways across different life contexts. In academic settings, a student might receive overwhelmingly positive feedback on a paper with one minor criticism, yet focus exclusively on the negative comment while completely dismissing the praise. In work environments, someone might receive glowing performance reviews year after year, but fixate on the one area marked for improvement, concluding that they're inadequate employees. In relationships, a person might ignore countless expressions of love and affection from their partner, while obsessing over a single moment of irritation or distraction. The emotional consequences of mental filtering are profound and persistent. This distortion creates a chronic negative emotional state where individuals feel consistently disappointed, inadequate, and hopeless about their circumstances. Despite objective evidence of success, positive relationships, and personal growth, the person experiences their life as fundamentally flawed and disappointing. This emotional state often leads to decreased motivation, as positive outcomes are not experienced as reinforcing when they're filtered out of conscious awareness. Behaviorally, mental filtering often leads to self-defeating patterns where individuals underperform due to their distorted self-perception. They might avoid challenges because they believe they're inadequate, decline opportunities because they focus on potential problems, or sabotage relationships because they can't perceive the positive elements. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where the person's behavior begins to match their negatively filtered perception of themselves. The cognitive mechanisms underlying mental filtering involve several psychological processes. Selective attention plays a central role, where the individual's cognitive resources are disproportionately allocated to processing negative information. Memory bias also contributes, as negative experiences are more readily recalled and rehearsed, while positive experiences are quickly forgotten or minimized. Confirmation bias operates to seek out information that confirms the negative worldview while ignoring or dismissing contradictory evidence. Neurobiologically, mental filtering appears to involve dysregulation in the brain's attention and memory systems. The anterior cingulate cortex, which helps direct attention, may become biased toward negative stimuli, while the hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, may preferentially encode negative experiences. This creates a neurobiological foundation for the distorted perception that characterizes mental filtering. Treatment approaches for mental filtering focus on broadening the individual's perceptual lens to include positive and neutral information. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as keeping positive data logs, where individuals systematically record positive experiences, compliments, and successes. Therapists might use perspective-taking exercises, where clients imagine how a balanced friend might view their situation, helping them recognize the information they're filtering out. Mindfulness-based interventions prove particularly effective for mental filtering, as they help individuals develop awareness of their selective attention patterns. Through mindfulness practice, people learn to notice when they're refocusing exclusively on negative aspects of their experience, and can consciously redirect their attention to include the full spectrum of their reality. This doesn't involve forced positive thinking, but rather developing a more complete and accurate perception of their circumstances. Recovery from mental filtering involves developing what psychologists call balanced attention, the ability to perceive both positive and negative aspects of experiences without being dominated by either extreme. This includes learning to actively seek out positive information, to give appropriate weight to compliments and achievements, and to maintain a realistic perspective on setbacks and criticisms. Practical strategies for managing mental filtering include the 3 good things exercise, where individuals write down 3 positive experiences each day, creating evidence files that contain positive feedback and achievements, and practicing attention training, where focus is deliberately directed toward positive and neutral aspects of experiences. Many people find it helpful to have trusted friends or family members serve as reality checks, who can point out positive elements that are being filtered out. 4. Emotional reasoning represents a cognitive distortion where individuals use their emotions as the primary or sole evidence for the truth of their thoughts and the reality of their situations. This thinking pattern operates on the faulty premise that feelings automatically reflect factual reality. If someone feels stupid, they must be stupid. If they feel hopeless, their situation must be hopeless. If they feel anxious, there must be genuine danger present. This distortion essentially treats emotions as infallible sources of information about external reality and personal truth. The psychological foundations of emotional reasoning often develop during childhood when emotional experiences are overwhelming and adults fail to help the child understand and contextualize their feelings. Children naturally experience emotions as all-consuming and absolute, and without proper guidance in developing emotional intelligence, they may carry this pattern into adulthood. Additionally, individuals who have experienced trauma or have certain personality dispositions may be more susceptible to emotional reasoning as their emotional responses become hyperactivated and difficult to regulate. Emotional reasoning manifests across numerous life domains in various ways. In relationships, someone might feel rejected during a partner's busy period and conclude that they're unloved, despite abundant evidence of affection and commitment. In work settings, a person might feel anxious before a presentation and interpret this anxiety as evidence that they are incompetent and will certainly fail, regardless of their preparation and past successes. In social situations, feeling embarrassed about a minor mistake might lead someone to conclude that everyone thinks they're foolish and will remember the incident forever. The emotional consequences of emotional reasoning create a self-perpetuating cycle where distorted thoughts generate intense emotions, which are then used as evidence to support the original distorted thoughts. This creates an emotional amplification effect where feelings become increasingly intense and overwhelming. The person becomes trapped in emotional states that seem to validate themselves, making it extremely difficult to access rational thinking or consider alternative perspectives. Behaviorally, emotional reasoning often leads to impulsive decisions based on temporary emotional states, rather than careful consideration of facts and long-term consequences. Someone might quit a job because they feel overwhelmed one day, end a relationship because they feel unloved during a conflict, or avoid opportunities because they feel inadequate. These behaviors often have long-term negative consequences that would not occur if decisions were based on a more balanced assessment of the situation. The cognitive mechanisms underlying emotional reasoning involve several psychological processes. Mood-congruent thinking occurs where individuals selectively attend to information that matches their current emotional state. Emotional memory bias leads to enhanced recall of experiences that align with current feelings, while suppressing memories that contradict the emotional narrative. Additionally, there's often a confusion between correlation and causation. Because strong emotions and certain thoughts occur together, they're assumed to be causally related. Neurobiologically, emotional reasoning appears to involve overactivation of the limbic system, with insufficient regulation from the prefrontal cortex. This creates a state where emotional processing dominates rational analysis, making it difficult to step back and evaluate thoughts and feelings objectively. The insula, which processes internal bodily sensations, may also be hyperactive, making emotional physical sensations feel more significant and meaningful than they actually are. Treatment approaches for emotional reasoning focus on helping individuals distinguish between emotional experiences and factual reality. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as thought records, where clients learn to identify thoughts, feelings, and evidence separately. Therapists might use emotional thermometer, exercises where clients rate the intensity of their feelings, and then examine whether the evidence supports conclusions drawn from those feelings. Dialectical behavior therapy is particularly effective for emotional reasoning, as it specifically addresses the tendency to be overwhelmed by emotions. DBT teaches skills such as checking the facts, where individuals learn to examine evidence for their emotional reactions, and opposite action, where they act contrary to emotion-driven impulses when emotions are not justified by facts. Mindfulness skills help individuals observe their emotions without being controlled by them. Recovery from emotional reasoning involves developing what psychologists call emotional intelligence, the ability to understand, experience, and express emotions while maintaining rational thinking capacities. This includes learning to use emotions as valuable information about one's needs and preferences while not treating them as absolute truth about external reality. Practical strategies for managing emotional reasoning include creating fact versus feeling lists where individuals separate emotional experiences from objective evidence, practicing emotional surfing, where they observe emotions without acting on them immediately, and developing wise mind skills where decisions integrate both emotional and rational information. Many people find it helpful to establish cooling off periods before making important decisions during intense emotional states. 5. Mind reading represents a cognitive distortion where individuals assume they know what others are thinking, feeling, or intending without having any concrete evidence to support these assumptions. This thinking pattern involves making definitive conclusions about others' mental states based on limited information, such as facial expressions, tone of voice, or behaviors, often interpreting neutral or ambiguous cues as evidence of negative judgments or intentions. People who engage in mind reading typically assume that others are thinking critically about them, focusing on their flaws, or harboring negative feelings toward them. The psychological origins of mind reading often trace back to early attachment experiences and social learning. Children who grow up in environments where emotional expression is unpredictable, or where they needed to become hypervigilant about others' moods for safety, may develop heightened sensitivity to social cues. Additionally, individuals with social anxiety, low self-esteem, or past experiences of rejection may be more prone to mind reading as a way to anticipate and prepare for potential social threats. The distortion can also stem from projection, where individuals assume others think the same negative thoughts about them that they think about themselves. Mind reading manifests in various ways across different social contexts. In romantic relationships, someone might interpret their partner's quietness as evidence that they're angry or dissatisfied, without considering alternative explanations such as tiredness, stress, or simply needing space. In workplace settings, a person might assume that a colleague's brief interaction means they're being judged as incompetent, ignoring the possibility that the colleague is simply busy or preoccupied. In social gatherings, someone might interpret a friend's distracted behavior as evidence that they're boring or unwelcome, rather than considering that the friend might be dealing with personal issues. The emotional consequences of mind reading are significant and far-reaching. This distortion creates chronic anxiety about social interactions, as individuals constantly worry about others' negative judgments and reactions. It generates feelings of paranoia, insecurity, and social isolation as the person becomes convinced that others view them negatively. The constant mental energy devoted to analyzing and interpreting others' supposed thoughts is exhausting and interferes with the ability to be present and authentic in relationships. Behaviorally, mind reading often leads to defensive or avoidant patterns in social interactions. Individuals might withdraw from relationships to avoid imagined criticism, become overly accommodating to prevent perceived disapproval, or engage in constant reassurance, seeking to confirm or disconfirm their assumptions. These behaviors often create the very problems they're trying to prevent, as others may find the withdrawal, people-pleasing, or constant need for reassurance frustrating or off-putting. The cognitive mechanisms underlying mind reading involve several psychological processes. Projection plays a significant role where individuals attribute their own thoughts and feelings to others. Confirmation bias operates to selectively notice and remember information that supports their assumptions while ignoring contradictory evidence. Attribution bias leads to consistently interpreting ambiguous social cues in personally relevant and typically negative ways. Additionally, there is often a lack of theory of mind flexibility, the inability to consider that others might have different perspectives, preoccupations, or ways of expressing themselves. Neurobiologically, mind reading appears to involve hyperactivation of the brain's social cognition networks, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex and temporal parietal junction, which are involved in understanding others' mental states. However, this hyperactivation is coupled with biased processing that favors negative interpretations. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for social threats, may also be overactive, creating a state of chronic social vigilance. Treatment approaches for mind reading focus on helping individuals recognize and challenge their assumptions about others' thoughts and feelings. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as thought challenging, where clients examine evidence for and against their mind-reading assumptions. Therapists might use role-playing exercises where clients practice asking directly about others' thoughts and feelings rather than making assumptions. Behavioral experiments can be particularly effective, where individuals test their assumptions by seeking direct feedback or observing others' actual responses. Social skills training can also be beneficial, helping individuals develop better abilities to read actual social cues rather than projecting their own fears and assumptions. This might include learning to recognize the difference between definitive signs of others, mental states, and ambiguous information that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Recovery from mind reading involves developing what psychologists call social cognitive flexibility, the ability to consider multiple possible explanations for others' behaviors, and to tolerate uncertainty about others' thoughts and feelings. This includes learning to ask questions instead of making assumptions, to consider situational factors that might influence others' behavior, and to recognize that others' thoughts and feelings are often more complex and less personally focused than imagined. Practical strategies for managing mind reading include practicing alternative explanation, exercises where individuals generate multiple possible reasons for others' behaviors developing, reality checking skills where they seek direct information rather than relying on assumptions, and learning to use I statements to express their perceptions rather than stating assumptions as facts. Many people find it helpful to keep a mind-reading log where they record their assumptions and later note what actually happened, providing concrete evidence of the distortion's inaccuracy. 6. Fortune-telling represents a cognitive distortion where individuals make definitive predictions about future events, typically focusing on negative outcomes, despite lacking sufficient evidence to support these predictions. This thinking pattern involves a false sense of certainty about future events, often characterized by phrases like, "I know this will happen," "It's bound to fail," or "Things will never get better." Unlike healthy planning or reasonable concern about potential challenges, fortune-telling involves rigid, pessimistic predictions that are treated as inevitable facts rather than possibilities to consider and prepare for. The psychological foundations of fortune-telling often develop as a misguided attempt to gain control over uncertain and potentially threatening future events. Individuals who have experienced significant losses, traumas, or disappointments may develop this distortion as a way to protect themselves from future hurt. By predicting and expecting negative outcomes, they believe they can avoid the pain of disappointment. Additionally, those with anxiety disorders or depression may engage in fortune-telling as their emotional states color their perceptions of future possibilities, making negative outcomes seem more likely and inevitable than they actually are. Fortune-telling manifests across numerous life domains in various ways. In career contexts, someone might predict with certainty that they won't get a promotion, won't succeed in a new job, or will eventually be fired, despite having adequate qualifications and performance records. In relationships, a person might predict that their partner will leave them, that they'll end up alone, or that conflicts will inevitably lead to breakups. In health-related situations, someone might predict that physical symptoms indicate serious illness, or that their health will continuously deteriorate regardless of medical intervention. The emotional consequences of fortune-telling are severe and self-reinforcing. This distortion creates chronic anxiety about the future, as individuals live in constant anticipation of predicted disasters. It generates feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, as the person believes negative outcomes are inevitable and beyond their control. The emotional energy devoted to worrying about predicted futures is exhausting and interferes with the ability to enjoy present moments or take productive action toward goals. Behaviorally, fortune-telling often leads to self-defeating patterns where individuals either avoid opportunities to prevent predicted failures or engage in behaviors that actually increase the likelihood of negative outcomes. Someone who predicts they'll be rejected might avoid social situations entirely, thereby missing opportunities for connection and inadvertently increasing their isolation. Similarly, someone who predicts career failure might not apply for positions or might perform poorly due to anxiety, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The cognitive mechanisms underlying fortune-telling involve several psychological processes. Probability overestimation occurs, where individuals assign unrealistically high likelihood to negative events while underestimating positive possibilities. Temporal distortion plays a role, where predicted negative events feel imminent and certain rather than distant and uncertain. Selective attention focuses on information that confirms negative predictions while ignoring evidence that suggests positive outcomes are possible. Additionally, there is often a confusion between possibility and probability. Just because something could happen doesn't mean it will happen. Neurobiologically, fortune-telling appears to involve overactivation of the brain's threat detection systems, particularly the amygdala, combined with biased processing in the prefrontal cortex, where future scenarios are evaluated. The default mode network, which is active during rest and introspection, may become dominated by negative future-focused rumination. This creates a state where the brain becomes biased toward generating and believing negative predictions about future events. Treatment approaches for fortune-telling focus on helping individuals develop more realistic and flexible thinking about future possibilities. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as probability estimation, where clients learn to assess the actual likelihood of predicted events more accurately. Therapists might use evidence examination, where clients explore historical data about similar situations to challenge their predictions. Worst-case scenario planning can be helpful, where individuals plan for various outcomes without assuming negative ones are inevitable. Mindfulness-based interventions are particularly effective for fortune-telling, as they help individuals recognize when they are re-engaging in future-focused worry and can bring attention back to present-moment experiences. This reduces the emotional intensity of predictions and creates space for more balanced thinking about future possibilities. Recovery from fortune-telling involves developing what psychologists call realistic optimism, the ability to acknowledge potential challenges while maintaining openness to positive possibilities. This includes learning to distinguish between helpful planning and unhelpful prediction, developing tolerance for uncertainty about future events, and building confidence in one's ability to cope with whatever actually occurs. Practical strategies for managing fortune-telling include creating prediction logs where individuals record their predictions and later note what actually happened, practicing best case, worst case, most likely case scenario planning, and developing uncertainty tolerance, skills where they learn to be comfortable with not knowing how things will turn out. Many people find it helpful to focus on next steps rather than ultimate outcomes, breaking down overwhelming future predictions into manageable present-moment actions. 7. Personalization represents a cognitive distortion where individuals take responsibility for events, outcomes, or other people's emotions and behaviors that are actually outside their control or influence. This thinking pattern involves an inflated sense of personal causation, where the person believes they are responsible for negative events or others' distress. even when there is little or no logical connection between their actions and the outcomes. Personalization can manifest as taking blame for things that go wrong, or conversely, taking excessive credit for positive events that were largely due to external factors. The psychological origins of personalization often stem from early developmental experiences, where children were inappropriately held responsible for family dynamics, parental emotions, or household problems. Children who grow up in dysfunctional families may develop an inflated sense of responsibility as a way to maintain some feeling of control in chaotic situations. Additionally, individuals with certain personality traits, such as high empathy or perfectionism, may be more prone to personalization as they become overly invested in others' well-being and outcomes. Personalization manifests in various ways across different life contexts. In family relationships, someone might blame themselves for their parents' divorce, their siblings' problems, or their child's difficulties at school, despite these issues having complex causes beyond any individual's control. In workplace settings, a person might take responsibility for team failures, colleagues' mistakes, or organizational problems, assuming they could have prevented these outcomes if they had acted differently. In social situations, someone might blame themselves for a friend's bad mood, a party's awkward atmosphere, or a group's lack of enthusiasm. The emotional consequences of personalization are profound and exhausting. This distortion creates chronic guilt and shame, as individuals constantly feel responsible for problems and negative outcomes around them. It generates anxiety about their impact on others and situations, leading to hypervigilance about their behavior and its potential consequences. The emotional burden of carrying responsibility for things beyond their control is overwhelming and often leads to depression, resentment, and emotional burnout. Behaviorally, personalization often leads to people-pleasing patterns where individuals exhaust themselves trying to manage others' emotions and prevent negative outcomes. They might become overly accommodating, constantly apologizing, or taking on excessive responsibilities to avoid feeling responsible for problems. This can also lead to avoidance behaviors, where people withdraw from situations or relationships to prevent their imagined negative impact on others. The cognitive mechanisms underlying personalization involve several psychological processes. Causal attribution bias leads individuals to overestimate their role in causing events while underestimating situational factors and others. Contributions. Egocentric thinking makes it difficult to consider that events might have causes unrelated to oneself. Responsibility inflation occurs where individuals take on more responsibility than is realistically theirs. Additionally, there is often a confusion between influence and control. Just because someone might have some influence in a situation doesn't mean they have control over the outcome. Neurobiologically, personalization appears to involve hyperactivation of brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and emotional processing. The medial prefrontal cortex, which processes self-relevant information, may be overactive, leading to excessive self-focus and attribution of causation. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in monitoring for conflicts and errors, may also be hyperactive, creating a tendency to scan for ways the person might be responsible for problems. Treatment approaches for personalization focus on helping individuals develop more realistic assessments of their actual responsibility and influence in various situations. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as responsibility pie charts, where clients divide up the actual factors that contributed to an outcome, often discovering that their role was much smaller than they initially believed. Therapists might use influence versus control exercises where clients learn to distinguish between things they can influence and things they can actually control. Boundary work is crucial in treating personalization, as individuals need to learn where their responsibilities end and others begin. This might involve exploring family of origin issues where inappropriate responsibility was assigned, developing assertiveness skills to avoid taking on others' problems, and learning to tolerate others' distress without feeling responsible for fixing it. Recovery from personalization involves developing what psychologists call appropriate responsibility, the ability to take ownership of one's actual choices and actions, while recognizing that many outcomes are influenced by multiple factors beyond any individual's control. This includes learning to consider alternative explanations for events, to acknowledge others' agency and responsibility, and to accept that some negative outcomes are inevitable regardless of one's actions. Practical strategies for managing personalization include creating responsibility inventories, where individuals list what they are and aren't responsible for in various situations, practicing alternative cause, exercises where they generate other possible reasons for events, and developing boundary statements that help them avoid taking on inappropriate responsibility. Many people find it helpful to ask themselves, what evidence do I have that this is actually my fault? And what would I tell a friend in this situation? 8. Should statements represent a cognitive distortion where individuals create rigid, inflexible rules about how they, others, or the world should, must, or ought to behave or function. This thinking pattern involves applying absolute standards and expectations that often ignore context, individual differences, and realistic limitations. Should statements create internal pressure and external judgment, leading to feelings of guilt, anger, and frustration when reality inevitably fails to meet these unrealistic expectations. The psychological origins of should statements often trace back to early experiences with highly critical, demanding, or perfectionistic caregivers who imposed rigid standards and conditional acceptance. Children who grow up in environments where love and approval are contingent upon meeting specific expectations may internalize these external demands as internal shoulds. Additionally, cultural, religious, or social influences that emphasize rigid moral codes or behavioral expectations can contribute to the development of should statements as a way of navigating complex social and ethical situations. Should statements manifest in various ways across different life domains. Self-directed shoulds might include beliefs like, I should never make mistakes, I should always be productive, or I should be able to handle everything perfectly. Other directed shoulds often involve expectations such as, people should always be considerate, my partner should know what I need without me asking, or my children should always appreciate what I do for them. World-directed shoulds might include beliefs like, life should be fair, hard work should always be rewarded, or bad things shouldn't happen to good people. The emotional consequences of should statements are significant and pervasive. When applied to oneself, these statements create chronic guilt, shame, and self-criticism when the impossible standards inevitably aren't met. Self-directed shoulds often lead to anxiety, depression, and perfectionism, as individuals constantly feel inadequate and disappointing. When applied to others, should statements generate anger, resentment, and relationship conflict, as people inevitably fail to meet these rigid expectations. World-directed shoulds create frustration, bitterness, and a sense of injustice when reality doesn't conform to how things should be. Behaviorally, should statements often lead to procrastination, avoidance, or compulsive behaviors as individuals struggle to meet impossible standards. Self-directed shoulds might cause someone to avoid starting projects for fear of not doing them perfectly, or to work obsessively to meet unrealistic expectations. Other directed shoulds can lead to controlling behaviors, constant criticism of others, or social withdrawal when people fail to meet expectations. The rigid nature of should statements often interferes with flexibility and adaptability in relationships and situations. The cognitive mechanisms underlying should statements involve several psychological processes. Perfectionism plays a central role, where individuals set unrealistically high standards for themselves and others. Cognitive rigidity makes it difficult to consider contextual factors, individual differences, or alternative perspectives. Moral reasoning becomes oversimplified, with complex ethical and behavioral questions reduced to absolute rules. Additionally, there is often a confusion between preferences and moral imperatives. Wanting something to be a certain way becomes transformed into believing it must be that way. Neurobiologically, should statements appear to involve overactivation of brain regions associated with cognitive control and moral reasoning. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive control and rule following, may be hyperactive, creating rigid adherence to internalized rules. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for conflicts between expectations and reality, may also be overactive, creating constant distress when shoulds aren't met. Treatment approaches for should statements focus on helping individuals recognize and challenge their rigid thinking patterns while developing more flexible and realistic expectations. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as should statement identification, where clients learn to notice when they are reusing absolute language and rigid expectations. Therapists might use preference transformation, exercises where clients practice rephrasing shoulds as preferences or wishes, such as changing "I should never make mistakes" to "I prefer to do things well, but mistakes are normal and human." Rational emotive behavior therapy is particularly effective for should statements, as it specifically targets what Albert Ellis called masturbation, the tendency to impose absolute demands on oneself, others, and the world. REBT helps individuals distinguish between healthy preferences and unhealthy demands, developing more flexible and realistic thinking patterns. Recovery from should statements involves developing what psychologists call flexible thinking, the ability to maintain standards and preferences while accepting that reality often doesn't conform to our wishes. This includes learning to consider contextual factors, individual differences, and realistic limitations when evaluating situations and behaviors. Practical strategies for managing should statements include creating should logs, where individuals track their use of absolute language and practice rephrasing statements, or flexibly developing exception lists, where they identify situations where their shoulds don't apply, and practicing preference language, where they express desires without demanding that reality conform to them. Many people find it helpful to ask themselves, "Says who?" when they notice should statements, examining the source and validity of their rigid expectations. 9. Labeling represents a cognitive distortion where individuals assign global, stable, and typically negative characterizations to themselves or others based on specific behaviors, mistakes, or characteristics. This thinking pattern involves taking isolated incidents or particular traits and using them to define entire identities, such as moving from "I made a mistake" to "I am stupid," or from "he was rude" to "he is a terrible person." Labeling transforms specific, changeable behaviors into seemingly permanent, all-encompassing identity statements that ignore the complexity and variability of human nature. The psychological origins of labeling often stem from early experiences with harsh criticism, name-calling, or identity-based judgment. Children who are regularly called names or have their identities defined by their mistakes or shortcomings may internalize this pattern of global evaluation. Additionally, individuals who grow up in environments where people are categorized and judged rather than understood in their complexity may develop labeling as a way to make sense of themselves and others. Perfectionism can also contribute to labeling, as the inability to accept flaws or mistakes leads to identity-based conclusions about inadequacy. Labeling manifests in various ways across different contexts. Self-labeling might include calling oneself stupid after making an error, lazy after procrastinating, worthless after a rejection, or crazy after experiencing emotional distress. Other labeling often involves characterizing people as selfish, mean, incompetent, or hopeless based on limited interactions or specific behaviors. These labels become mental shortcuts that prevent deeper understanding and create rigid expectations about future behavior. The emotional consequences of labeling are profound and lasting. Self-labeling creates shame, self-hatred, and a sense of fundamental inadequacy that goes far beyond appropriate guilt about specific actions. These global negative identities become self-fulfilling prophecies as individuals begin to act in ways consistent with their labels. Other labeling generates anger, resentment, and relationship conflict as people become defined by their worst moments rather than understood in their full humanity. The emotional intensity of labels often overwhelms more nuanced and accurate perceptions. Behaviorally, labeling often leads to avoidance, self-sabotage, or aggressive patterns. Self-labeling might cause someone to avoid challenges because they believe they're stupid or incompetent, or to engage in behaviors that confirm their negative self-image. Other labeling can lead to dismissive, hostile, or punitive behaviors toward those who have been negatively labeled. The rigid nature of labels interferes with growth, learning, and relationship repair. The cognitive mechanisms underlying labeling involve several psychological processes. Overgeneralization occurs, where specific instances are treated as universal truths about identity. Dichotomous thinking reduces complex human qualities to simple categories. Fundamental attribution error leads to attributing behaviors to stable personality characteristics rather than situational factors. Additionally, confirmation bias operates to notice and remember information that confirms labels while ignoring contradictory evidence. Neurobiologically, labeling appears to involve rapid activation of categorization systems in the brain, particularly in areas like the temporal cortex that process semantic information about identity and characteristics. The emotional labeling of self and others activates the amygdala and related limbic structures, creating strong emotional associations with these identity categories. This emotional intensity makes labels feel more true and significant than they actually are. Treatment approaches for labeling focus on helping individuals develop more specific, behavioral, and contextual ways of understanding themselves and others. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as label to behavior, exercises where clients practice describing specific actions rather than using global characterizations. Therapists might use evidence examination, where clients explore whether their labels are supported by comprehensive evidence or based on limited incidents. Compassion-focused therapy can be particularly effective for labeling, as it helps individuals develop more kind and understanding relationships with themselves and others. This includes learning to see mistakes and flaws as part of common human experience rather than evidence of fundamental inadequacy. Recovery from labeling involves developing what psychologists call behavioral specificity, the ability to describe actions, feelings, and characteristics without making global identity statements. This includes learning to separate behaviors from identity, to consider contextual factors that influence behavior, and to maintain curiosity about the complexity of human nature. Practical strategies for managing labeling include creating behavior description, practices where individuals describe what happened rather than what someone is, developing context consideration skills, where they explore situational factors that might influence behavior, and practicing identity flexibility, where they recognize that all people contain multitudes and cannot be reduced to simple categories. Many people find it helpful to ask themselves, what specifically did they do? Rather than, what does this mean about who they am, are? 10. Disqualifying the positive represents a cognitive distortion where individuals systematically reject, minimize, or explain away positive experiences, achievements, compliments, or feedback, often dismissing them as not counting, being due to luck, or being insincere. This thinking pattern involves an active process of mental filtering where positive information is not simply overlooked, but is actively discredited or reinterpreted in negative ways. Unlike simple pessimism, Disqualifying the positive involves elaborate explanations for why good things do and count or reflect positively on the person. The psychological origins of disqualifying the positive often trace back to early experiences with inconsistent praise, conditional acceptance, or environments where positive feedback was rare or followed by criticism. Children who grow up with caregivers who frequently give backhanded compliments, withdraw affection after showing approval, or create environments where positive recognition feels dangerous may develop this distortion as a protective mechanism. Additionally, individuals with depression, low self-esteem, or perfectionism may engage in this pattern as a way to maintain consistency with their negative self-image. Disqualifying the positive manifests in various ways across different life domains. In academic or professional settings, someone might dismiss good grades as easy tests, attribute successful projects to lucky timing, or explain positive performance reviews as supervisors just being nice. In relationships, positive feedback might be dismissed as they're just trying to make me feel better. Expressions of love might be reinterpreted as they don't really know me, or compliments might be rejected as they're just being polite. In personal achievements, successes might be attributed to external factors, while failures are seen as revealing true inadequacy. The emotional consequences of disqualifying the positive are significant and self-perpetuating. This distortion prevents individuals from experiencing the natural mood-boosting effects of positive experiences, compliments, and achievements. It maintains and reinforces negative self-image and depressive states, as positive evidence that could challenge these negative beliefs is systematically discredited. The inability to internalize positive feedback creates chronic feelings of inadequacy and prevents the development of healthy self-esteem and confidence. Behaviorally, disqualifying the positive often leads to achievement avoidance, self-sabotage, or excessive reassurance seeking. Someone might avoid situations where they might receive positive feedback to prevent the discomfort of having to dismiss it. They might also engage in behaviors that confirm their negative self-image, or constantly seek validation while simultaneously rejecting it when it's offered. This pattern can be frustrating for others who are trying to offer genuine support and recognition. The cognitive mechanisms underlying disqualifying the positive involve several psychological processes. Cognitive consistency bias operates to maintain existing negative beliefs by rejecting information that challenges them. Selective attention focuses on potential flaws or alternative explanations for positive events. Memory bias leads to better recall of negative events, while positive experiences are quickly forgotten or distorted. Additionally, there is often a double standard where positive events require extraordinary evidence to be accepted, while negative events are readily believed. Neurobiologically, disqualifying the positive appears to involve dysregulation in the brain's reward processing systems. The ventral striatum and associated dopamine pathways, which normally respond to positive experiences, may be hypoactive or disrupted. The prefrontal cortex may be overactive in generating alternative explanations for positive events, while the default mode network may be dominated by negative self-referential thinking. Treatment approaches for disqualifying the positive focus on helping individuals recognize and challenge their tendency to dismiss positive information. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as positive data logs, where clients systematically record positive experiences and practice accepting them at face value. Therapists might use evidence examination, where clients explore whether their dismissals of positive feedback are logical or based on distorted thinking patterns. Behavioral activation can be particularly effective, as it encourages individuals to engage in activities that naturally generate positive experiences and feedback, providing more opportunities to practice accepting positive information. Mindfulness-based interventions help individuals notice when they re-dismissing positive experiences and can create space to consider alternative interpretations. Recovery from disqualifying the positive involves developing what psychologists call positive integration, the ability to accept, internalize, and build upon positive experiences and feedback. This includes learning to tolerate the discomfort that may initially arise from accepting positive information, developing more balanced explanations for positive events, and building capacity to experience genuine satisfaction and pride in achievements. Practical strategies for managing disqualifying the positive include creating positive evidence files where individuals collect and review positive feedback and achievements, practicing acceptance responses to compliments rather than deflecting them, and developing balanced attribution skills where they consider multiple factors that contribute to positive outcomes, including their own efforts and abilities. Many people find it helpful to ask trusted friends or family members to point out when they dismissing positive feedback, providing external reality checks for their distorted processing. 11. Overgeneralization represents a cognitive distortion where individuals draw broad, sweeping conclusions about their abilities, worth, or future prospects based on single incidents or limited experiences. This thinking pattern involves taking isolated events and treating them as evidence of universal patterns, often using words like always, never, everyone, or everything to describe themselves or their circumstances. Overgeneralization transforms specific situational experiences into seemingly permanent, all-encompassing truths about identity, capability, and destiny. The psychological origins of overgeneralization often develop from early experiences with criticism, failure, or trauma that create lasting impressions about self-worth and capability. Children who experience significant rejection, academic failure, or social difficulties may generalize these experiences into broad beliefs about their inadequacy or unlovability. Additionally, individuals with depression, anxiety, or perfectionism may be more prone to overgeneralization, as their emotional states color their interpretation of events, making negative experiences feel more significant and universal than they actually are. Overgeneralization manifests in various ways across different life contexts. In academic settings, someone might conclude after one poor test performance that they're terrible at math or not college material, ignoring previous successes and the specific circumstances that contributed to the poor performance. In relationships, a single rejection might lead to beliefs like, "I'll never find love," or "everyone finds me unattractive," despite limited evidence for such broad conclusions. In work environments, one mistake might generate thoughts like, "I'm incompetent at everything," or "I'll never succeed in this field." The emotional consequences of overgeneralization are profound and persistent. This distortion creates feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, as single negative events are interpreted as evidence of fundamental inadequacy or permanent failure. It generates anxiety about future situations, as individuals expect to fail based on limited past experiences. The emotional intensity of overgeneralized conclusions often overwhelms more balanced and accurate assessments of abilities and circumstances. Behaviorally, overgeneralization often leads to avoidance patterns where individuals limit their activities and opportunities based on broad negative conclusions drawn from specific incidents. Someone might avoid all social situations because of one awkward interaction, decline career opportunities because of one past failure, or refuse to try new activities because of previous difficulties. This avoidance prevents the accumulation of contradictory evidence that could challenge the overgeneralized beliefs. The cognitive mechanisms underlying overgeneralization involve several psychological processes. Pattern recognition systems in the brain, which normally help identify genuine trends and regularities, become overactive and identify patterns where none exist. Selective attention focuses on information that confirms the overgeneralized belief while ignoring contradictory evidence. Memory bias enhances recall of experiences that support the generalization while suppressing memories that challenge it. Additionally, there's often a confusion between correlation and causation, where single events are treated as predictive of future outcomes. Neurobiologically, overgeneralization appears to involve dysregulation in the brain's learning and memory systems. The hippocampus, which processes new experiences and integrates them with existing knowledge, may become biased toward confirming existing negative beliefs rather than accurately updating them based on new information. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functions like reasoning and planning, may be impaired in its ability to consider multiple perspectives and evaluate evidence objectively. Treatment approaches for overgeneralization focus on helping individuals develop more specific, accurate, and balanced thinking about their experiences. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as examining the evidence, where clients explore whether their broad conclusions are supported by comprehensive data or based on limited incidents. Therapists might use exception-finding exercises where clients identify times when their overgeneralized beliefs didn't hold true. Behavioral experiments can be particularly effective for overgeneralization, as they provide opportunities to test broad negative beliefs against real-world experiences. By gradually engaging in avoided activities and situations, individuals can gather evidence that challenges their overgeneralized conclusions about their abilities and outcomes. Recovery from overgeneralization involves developing what psychologists call contextual thinking, the ability to consider specific circumstances, individual differences, and situational factors when evaluating experiences and drawing conclusions. This includes learning to distinguish between isolated incidents and genuine patterns, to consider multiple factors that contribute to outcomes, and to maintain openness to evidence that challenges existing beliefs. Practical strategies for managing overgeneralization include creating specificity practices where individuals describe experiences in detailed, contextual terms rather than using broad generalizations, developing evidence collection skills where they systematically gather information about their actual performance and outcomes across multiple situations, and practicing exception identification, where they actively look for times when their generalizations don't apply. Many people find it helpful to ask themselves, what specific evidence supports this broad conclusion? And what examples contradict this generalization? 12. Magnification and minimization represent cognitive distortions where individuals consistently exaggerate the importance or impact of negative events while simultaneously downplaying or reducing the significance of positive experiences. This thinking pattern, sometimes called the binocular trick, involves using a mental magnifying glass for problems, mistakes, and failures, while using a reducing lens for successes, strengths, and positive qualities. The result is a distorted perception of reality, where difficulties appear overwhelming and insurmountable, while resources and achievements seem insignificant and meaningless. The psychological origins of magnification and minimization often develop from early experiences with criticism, perfectionism, or emotional invalidation. Children who grow up in environments where their mistakes are heavily emphasized, while their successes are ignored or minimized, may internalize this evaluative pattern. Additionally, individuals with depression, anxiety, or low self-esteem may engage in this distortion as both a symptom and a maintaining factor of their emotional difficulties. The distorted perception reinforces negative mood states, which in turn strengthen the biased processing. Magnification and minimization manifest in various ways across different life domains. In academic settings, someone might magnify the importance of a single poor grade while minimizing consistently good performance, concluding that they're failing despite overwhelming evidence of success. In work environments, a person might exaggerate the significance of a minor mistake while dismissing major achievements, creating a distorted view of their professional competence. In relationships, someone might magnify the importance of conflicts while minimizing expressions of love and support, leading to unnecessary relationship distress. The emotional consequences of magnification and minimization are significant and self-perpetuating. This distortion creates chronic anxiety, depression, and feelings of inadequacy as individuals become overwhelmed by magnified problems, while feeling unsupported by minimized resources and achievements. The inability to accurately assess their capabilities and circumstances leads to learned helplessness and decreased motivation to pursue goals or address challenges. The emotional intensity generated by magnified problems often overwhelms rational problem-solving abilities. Behaviorally, magnification and minimization often lead to avoidance, procrastination, or excessive worry about relatively minor issues. Someone might avoid opportunities because magnified fears of failure seem insurmountable, or spend excessive time worrying about problems that are actually manageable. The minimization of positive experiences prevents individuals from building confidence and resilience, as they don't internalize their successes or recognize their strengths and resources. The cognitive mechanisms underlying magnification and minimization involve several psychological processes. Attention bias directs mental resources disproportionately toward negative information, while positive information receives inadequate processing. Memory bias enhances storage and recall of negative events, while positive experiences are poorly encoded or quickly forgotten. Emotional reasoning treats the intensity of feelings about events as evidence of their actual importance. Additionally, there's often a lack of perspective taking, where individuals can't step back and evaluate events in broader contexts. Neurobiologically, magnification and minimization appear to involve dysregulation in the brain's evaluation and attention systems. The amygdala may be hyperreactive to negative stimuli, creating enhanced emotional responses to problems and difficulties. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functions like planning and evaluation, may be impaired in its ability to maintain balanced perspectives on events. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for conflicts and problems, may be overactive, creating heightened attention to difficulties while positive information receives inadequate processing. Treatment approaches for magnification and minimization focus on helping individuals develop more balanced and realistic perspectives on their experiences. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as scaling, where clients rate the actual importance of events on a 1 to 10 scale, often discovering that their magnified problems are less significant than they initially believed. Therapists might use perspective taking, exercises where clients imagine how they would view their situation if it were happening to a friend. Mindfulness-based interventions can be particularly effective for magnification and minimization, as they help individuals observe their thoughts and feelings without being overwhelmed by them. This creates space for more balanced evaluation of events and experiences. Gratitude practices can help counteract the minimization of positive experiences by systematically focusing attention on achievements, strengths, and positive aspects of life. Recovery from magnification and minimization involves developing what psychologists call proportional thinking, the ability to evaluate events and experiences according to their actual importance and impact rather than their emotional intensity. This includes learning to consider multiple perspectives, to evaluate events in broader contexts, and to maintain awareness of both challenges and resources. Practical strategies for managing magnification and minimization include creating proportion checks, where individuals ask themselves whether they are giving appropriate weight to different aspects of their experience. Developing evidence balancing skills, where they systematically consider both positive and negative information, and practicing perspective broadening, where they consider how current events might seem in a week, month, or year. Many people find it helpful to keep balanced journals where they record both challenges and successes, ensuring that positive experiences receive appropriate attention and importance. 13. Cognitive fusion represents a cognitive distortion where individuals become overly attached to or entangled with their thoughts, treating them as absolute truth rather than mental events that can be observed, questioned, and evaluated. This thinking pattern involves a loss of psychological flexibility where Thoughts are experienced as literal reality, rather than mental constructs that may or may not accurately reflect actual circumstances. In cognitive fusion, there is no separation between the thinker and the thought. The person becomes completely identified with their mental content, making it difficult to consider alternative perspectives or respond flexibly to situations. The psychological origins of cognitive fusion often develop from cultural and educational experiences that emphasize the importance of rational thinking and logical analysis without teaching the skills to observe and evaluate thoughts objectively. In Western cultures, there's often an implicit belief that thoughts are inherently meaningful and should be taken seriously, rather than viewed as mental events that arise and pass away. Additionally, individuals with anxiety, depression, or obsessive-compulsive tendencies may be more prone to cognitive fusion as their emotional states make thoughts feel more urgent and significant. Cognitive fusion manifests in various ways across different life contexts. In anxiety-provoking situations, someone might become fused with thoughts like something terrible is going to happen, and respond as if this thought represents actual danger rather than a mental prediction. In depression, individuals might become fused with thoughts like, "I'm worthless," and act as if this thought represents an objective fact about their identity. In relationships, someone might become fused with jealous thoughts and respond as if their partner's imagined infidelity is actually occurring. The emotional consequences of cognitive fusion are profound and limiting. This distortion creates emotional volatility, where feelings fluctuate dramatically based on the content of thoughts rather than actual circumstances. It generates anxiety, depression, and distress as individuals become overwhelmed by the intensity of their mental content. The inability to step back from thoughts and observe them objectively leads to reactive behavior and decreased capacity for thoughtful decision-making. Behaviorally, cognitive fusion often leads to avoidance, compulsive behaviors, or emotional reactivity based on thought content rather than actual circumstances. Someone might avoid social situations because they're fused with thoughts about potential rejection, engage in compulsive checking behaviors because they're fused with thoughts about potential dangers, or have emotional outbursts because they're fused with thoughts about perceived slights or injustices. The cognitive mechanisms underlying cognitive fusion involve several psychological processes. Thought-action fusion occurs where individuals believe that having certain thoughts is equivalent to acting on them, or that thoughts can influence external events. Literal thinking treats metaphorical or evaluative thoughts as factual statements. Lack of metacognitive awareness means individuals don't recognize thoughts as mental events that can be observed and evaluated. Additionally, there's often confusion between internal experiences and external reality. Neurobiologically, cognitive fusion appears to involve overactivation of brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and verbal processing. The default mode network, which is active during rest and introspection, may become dominated by verbal mental content that feels highly significant and personally relevant. The prefrontal cortex may be impaired in its ability to maintain metacognitive awareness and cognitive flexibility. Treatment approaches for cognitive fusion focus on helping individuals develop psychological flexibility and the ability to observe thoughts without being controlled by them. Acceptance and commitment therapy is specifically designed to address cognitive fusion through techniques such as cognitive diffusion, where clients learn to see thoughts as mental events rather than absolute truths. Therapists might use exercises like thanking your mind for thoughts, labeling thoughts as just thoughts, or using silly voices to say thoughts aloud, reducing their emotional impact. Mindfulness-based interventions are particularly effective for cognitive fusion, as they directly teach the skills of observing mental content without being overwhelmed by it. Through mindfulness practice, individuals learn to notice thoughts arising and passing away without needing to engage with or believe them. This creates psychological space between the person and their thoughts, allowing for more flexible responses. Recovery from cognitive fusion involves developing what psychologists call psychological flexibility, the ability to stay present with experiences while choosing actions based on values rather than being controlled by thoughts and feelings. This includes learning to observe thoughts without judgment, to recognize the difference between thoughts and reality, and to choose responses based on what matters most rather than what the mind is saying. Practical strategies for managing cognitive fusion include practicing thought labeling, where individuals notice and name thoughts as mental events, developing diffusion phrases like, "I'm having the thought that ... to create distance from mental content, and using workability questions that ask whether believing and acting on thoughts moves them toward or away from their values. Many people find it helpful to imagine their thoughts as clouds passing through the sky or leaves floating down a stream, emphasizing their temporary and insubstantial nature. 14. Experiential avoidance represents a cognitive and behavioral pattern where individuals engage in persistent attempts to avoid, escape, or control unwanted thoughts, feelings, sensations, or memories, even when these efforts are ineffective or harmful in the long term. This pattern involves an intolerance for internal discomfort and a belief that psychological pain should be eliminated rather than experienced and processed. Paradoxically, experiential avoidance often increases the frequency and intensity of the very experiences that individuals are trying to avoid, creating cycles of distress and dysfunction. The psychological origins of experiential avoidance often develop from early experiences with overwhelming emotions, trauma, or environments where emotional expression was discouraged or punished. Children who grow up in families where feelings are viewed as dangerous, shameful, or unacceptable may learn to suppress or avoid emotional experiences. Additionally, cultural messages that emphasize the importance of feeling good and avoiding discomfort can contribute to the development of experiential avoidance as a coping strategy. Experiential avoidance manifests in various ways across different life domains. In emotional contexts, someone might use substances, compulsive behaviors, or distraction techniques to avoid feeling sadness, anxiety, or anger. In social situations, individuals might avoid relationships or intimate connections to prevent the possibility of rejection or vulnerability. In work or academic settings, someone might avoid challenging tasks or opportunities to prevent the experience of failure or criticism. The emotional consequences of experiential avoidance are significant and counterproductive. This pattern often increases psychological distress, as suppressed emotions tend to intensify and persist rather than naturally resolve. It creates emotional numbing, where individuals lose access to both positive and negative feelings, leading to a sense of emptiness and disconnection. The constant effort required to avoid internal experiences is exhausting and interferes with the ability to engage fully in life activities. Behaviorally, experiential avoidance often leads to increasingly narrow and restricted life patterns as individuals limit their activities to avoid potential triggers for unwanted internal experiences. This might involve avoiding social situations, declining opportunities, or engaging in safety behaviors that provide temporary relief but maintain long-term problems. The avoidance patterns often generalize, leading to broader life restrictions and decreased functioning. The cognitive mechanisms underlying experiential avoidance involve several psychological processes. Control beliefs lead individuals to assume that they should be able to control their internal experiences and that inability to do so represents failure or weakness. Emotional reasoning treats the presence of negative emotions as evidence of danger or problems that must be solved. Catastrophic thinking about internal experiences makes normal emotional responses feel unbearable and threatening. Neurobiologically, experiential avoidance appears to involve dysregulation in the brain's emotional processing systems. The amygdala and related limbic structures may be hyperreactive to emotional stimuli, creating intense desires to escape or avoid. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotion regulation, may be impaired in its ability to tolerate and process emotional experiences effectively. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for conflicts and problems, may be overactive in scanning for potential emotional threats. Treatment approaches for experiential avoidance focus on helping individuals develop tolerance for internal experiences and willingness to experience discomfort in service of valued goals. Acceptance and commitment therapy is specifically designed to address experiential avoidance through techniques that increase psychological flexibility and willingness to experience difficult emotions. Therapists might use exercises like willingness scales, where clients explore their willingness to experience discomfort for valued outcomes. Mindfulness-based interventions are particularly effective for experiential avoidance, as they directly teach skills for observing and accepting internal experiences without trying to change or escape them. Through mindfulness practice, individuals learn that thoughts and feelings are temporary experiences that can be observed without being overwhelmed or controlled by them. Recovery from experiential avoidance involves developing what psychologists call psychological flexibility, the ability to stay present with internal experiences while choosing actions based on values rather than comfort. This includes learning to view emotions as temporary and meaningful sources of information rather than problems to be solved, developing tolerance for discomfort, and building confidence in one's ability to cope with difficult experiences. Practical strategies for managing experiential avoidance include practicing urge surfing, where individuals observe cravings or impulses without acting on them, developing willingness practices, where they gradually expose themselves to avoided experiences, and using values clarification to identify what matters most and motivate engagement despite discomfort. Many people find it helpful to use metaphors like emotional weather to normalize the temporary nature of internal experiences. 15. Self-invalidation represents a cognitive distortion where individuals chronically dismiss, minimize, or reject their own emotions, thoughts, needs, or experiences as invalid, inappropriate, or not worthy of attention. This thinking pattern involves an internal critic that constantly judges and devalues the person's internal experiences, often accompanied by beliefs that their feelings are wrong, stupid, or overreactions. Self-invalidation creates a disconnection from one's authentic self and interferes with the development of self-compassion and healthy self-awareness. The psychological origins of self-invalidation often trace back to early experiences with emotional invalidation from caregivers, peers, or significant others. Children who grow up in environments where their emotions are regularly dismissed, criticized, or met with responses like "you being too sensitive" or "you shouldn't feel that way," may internalize these invalidating messages. Additionally, individuals who have experienced trauma, abuse, or severe criticism may develop self-invalidation as a protective mechanism to avoid further external invalidation. Self-invalidation manifests in various ways across different emotional and experiential contexts. Someone might dismiss their sadness about a loss as being dramatic, minimize their anger about mistreatment as being too sensitive, or reject their excitement about achievements as not that big a deal. In relationships, individuals might invalidate their needs for support or connection, telling themselves they're being needy or asking for too much. In challenging situations, they might dismiss their stress or anxiety as weakness or inability to handle normal life. The emotional consequences of self-invalidation are profound and damaging. This pattern creates chronic emotional confusion as individuals lose touch with their authentic feelings and needs. It generates shame and self-criticism, as the person constantly judges themselves harshly for having normal human experiences. The inability to validate their own experiences leads to decreased self-esteem, difficulty making decisions, and problems with emotional regulation. Behaviorally, self-invalidation often leads to people-pleasing patterns where individuals ignore their own needs to avoid potential criticism or rejection. They might overwork to prove their worth, avoid expressing preferences or boundaries, or constantly seek external validation because they can't provide it for themselves. The disconnection from authentic internal experiences often leads to poor decision-making and difficulty maintaining healthy relationships. The cognitive mechanisms underlying self-invalidation involve several psychological processes. Internalized criticism occurs where external critical voices become internal self-talk that constantly judges and devalues experiences. Emotional reasoning treats feelings as evidence of personal inadequacy rather than meaningful responses to circumstances. Perfectionism creates impossible standards for emotional responses, leading to constant self-criticism when normal human reactions occur. Neurobiologically, self-invalidation appears to involve overactivation of brain regions associated with self-criticism and threat detection. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for conflicts and problems, may be hyperactive in scanning for evidence of emotional wrongness. The prefrontal cortex may be impaired in its ability to provide self-compassion and balanced self-evaluation. The insula, which processes internal bodily sensations and emotional awareness, may be disconnected from conscious awareness. Treatment approaches for self-invalidation focus on helping individuals develop self-compassion and the ability to validate their own experiences. Dialectical behavior therapy specifically addresses self-invalidation through techniques that teach self-validation skills and emotional regulation. Therapists might use exercises like emotion validation, where clients practice accepting their feelings as understandable responses to their circumstances. Mindfulness-based interventions are particularly effective for self-invalidation, as they help individuals develop awareness of their internal experiences without judgment. Through mindfulness practice, people learn to observe their thoughts and feelings with curiosity and acceptance rather than criticism and rejection. Recovery from self-invalidation involves developing what psychologists call self-compassion, the ability to treat oneself with the same kindness and understanding that would be offered to a good friend. This includes learning to recognize emotions as valid responses to experiences, developing internal supportive self-talk, and building confidence in one's ability to understand and care for oneself. Practical strategies for managing self-invalidation include practicing self-validation statements, where individuals acknowledge their feelings as understandable, developing internal supportive voice. Exercises where they practice kind self-talk, and using friend perspective techniques, where they ask themselves how they would respond to a friend having the same experience. Many people find it helpful to keep validation journals, where they record their experiences and practice accepting them without judgment. 16. Awfulizing represents a cognitive distortion where individuals label situations, events, or experiences as awful, terrible, catastrophic, or unbearable, rather than realistically appraising them as disappointing, challenging, or difficult, but ultimately manageable. This thinking pattern involves emotional amplification, where relatively minor or moderate problems are elevated to the level of complete disasters, creating intense emotional responses that are disproportionate to the actual severity of the situation. Awfulizing transforms normal life challenges into seemingly insurmountable catastrophes. The psychological origins of awfulizing often develop from early experiences with limited coping resources or exposure to genuinely traumatic events that create lasting impressions about the nature of problems and one's ability to handle them. Children who grow up in environments where minor problems are treated as major crises may learn to evaluate all difficulties as awful and unbearable. Additionally, individuals with anxiety disorders, depression, or low frustration tolerance may be more prone to awfulizing, as their emotional states make normal challenges feel overwhelming and insurmountable. Awfulizing manifests in various ways across different life contexts. In work situations, someone might describe a challenging project as absolutely horrible or a difficult colleague as unbearable, rather than acknowledging these as manageable workplace challenges. In relationships, minor conflicts might be labeled as terrible or catastrophic, rather than normal disagreements that can be resolved. In daily life, situations like traffic delays, weather changes, or minor inconveniences might be described as awful rather than temporary annoyances. The emotional consequences of awfulizing are significant and exhausting. This distortion creates intense emotional responses to relatively minor problems, leading to chronic stress, anxiety, and emotional volatility. The amplified language creates amplified feelings, making individuals feel overwhelmed by challenges that they could otherwise handle effectively. The emotional intensity generated by awfulizing often impairs problem-solving abilities and creates a sense of helplessness about managing normal life difficulties. Behaviorally, awfulizing often leads to avoidance, procrastination, or emotional outbursts in response to challenges that are actually manageable. Someone might avoid situations entirely because they've labeled them as awful, or react with extreme emotional distress to problems that require calm, rational responses. The intense emotional reactions generated by awfulizing can strain relationships and interfere with effective coping strategies. The cognitive mechanisms underlying awfulizing involve several psychological processes. Emotional amplification occurs where the intensity of language used to describe events increases the emotional response to those events. Catastrophic thinking treats moderate problems as complete disasters requiring extreme reactions. Frustration intolerance creates beliefs that difficult situations should not exist and cannot be endured. Additionally, there's often a confusion between discomfort and disaster, where unpleasant experiences are treated as unbearable threats. Neurobiologically, awfulizing appears to involve overactivation of the brain's threat detection and emotional response systems. The amygdala may be hyperreactive to stressful stimuli, creating intense emotional responses to moderate challenges. The prefrontal cortex may be impaired in its ability to accurately assess threat levels and maintain perspective on problems. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for conflicts and problems, may be overactive in scanning for potential disasters. Treatment approaches for awfulizing focus on helping individuals develop more realistic and proportionate language for describing their experiences. Rational emotive behavior therapy specifically addresses awfulizing through techniques that help clients distinguish between inconvenience and catastrophe. Therapists might use scaling exercises where clients rate the actual severity of problems on a realistic scale, often discovering that their awful situations are actually moderate challenges. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as catastrophe scaling, where clients learn to evaluate problems more realistically, and language modification, where they practice describing situations in more balanced terms. This helps reduce the emotional intensity of problems and makes them feel more manageable. Recovery from awfulizing involves developing what psychologists call frustration tolerance, the ability to acknowledge that problems and inconveniences are part of normal life and can be managed without being treated as catastrophes. This includes learning to use more accurate language to describe experiences, developing realistic expectations about life's challenges, and building confidence in one's ability to cope with difficulties. Practical strategies for managing awfulizing include creating language awareness, practices where individuals notice when they reusing extreme language, and practice moderating their descriptions. Developing reality scaling skills where they rate problems on a 1 to 10 scale of actual severity, and using reframing statements that acknowledge problems as challenging but manageable. Many people find it helpful to ask themselves, in the grand scheme of things, how significant is this really? And will this matter in a year? 17. Dire necessity for approval represents a cognitive distortion where individuals believe it is essential, rather than simply preferable, to be loved, liked, and approved of by virtually everyone they encounter. This thinking pattern involves treating approval as a basic need for survival rather than a natural human desire, creating anxiety and desperation when approval is threatened or unavailable. The distortion transforms the healthy wish for acceptance into an absolute requirement that dominates decision-making and self-worth. The psychological origins of dire necessity for approval often trace back to early experiences with conditional love, where children learn that acceptance and safety depend on meeting others' expectations and gaining their approval. Children who grow up in environments where love is withdrawn when they displease others may develop beliefs that approval is necessary for survival and well-being. Additionally, individuals with social anxiety, low self-esteem, or attachment difficulties may be more prone to this distortion as they seek external validation to compensate for internal feelings of inadequacy. Dire necessity for approval manifests in various ways across different social contexts. In work environments, someone might agree to unreasonable requests, avoid expressing opinions, or sacrifice their own needs to maintain colleagues' approval. In relationships, individuals might suppress their authentic selves, avoid conflict at all costs, or tolerate mistreatment to prevent rejection. In social situations, they might exhaust themselves trying to please everyone, constantly seek reassurance about others' opinions, or avoid situations where approval is uncertain. The emotional consequences of dire necessity for approval are profound and limiting. This distortion creates chronic anxiety about others' reactions and constant fear of rejection or disapproval. It generates feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt as self-worth becomes dependent on external validation rather than internal self-acceptance. The emotional energy devoted to seeking and maintaining approval is exhausting and interferes with the development of authentic self-identity and genuine relationships. Behaviorally, dire necessity for approval often leads to people-pleasing patterns where individuals sacrifice their own needs, values, and desires to maintain others' positive opinions. They might overwork to gain approval, avoid expressing disagreement, or constantly seek reassurance about their acceptability. This pattern often creates superficial relationships based on performance rather than authentic connection, and can lead to resentment and burnout over time. The cognitive mechanisms underlying dire necessity for approval involve several psychological processes. Catastrophic thinking treats disapproval as a complete disaster rather than a normal part of human interaction. All-or-nothing thinking creates beliefs that one must be approved of by everyone or face complete rejection. Emotional reasoning treats the anxiety about potential disapproval as evidence that approval is actually necessary for survival. Additionally, there's often confusion between wants and needs, where the desire for approval is elevated to a life or death requirement. Neurobiologically, dire necessity for approval appears to involve overactivation of brain regions associated with social threat detection and reward processing. The amygdala may be hyperreactive to signs of potential rejection or disapproval, creating intense anxiety responses. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for social conflicts and rejection, may be overactive. The brain's reward systems may become dependent on external validation, making approval feel necessary for psychological well-being. Treatment approaches for dire necessity for approval focus on helping individuals develop internal sources of self-worth and realistic expectations about social acceptance. Rational emotive behavior therapy specifically addresses this distortion through techniques that help clients distinguish between preferences and dire necessities. Therapists might use approval experiments, where clients practice tolerating small amounts of disapproval to build confidence in their ability to survive rejection. Assertiveness training can be particularly effective, as it helps individuals learn to express their needs and opinions despite the possibility of disapproval. This builds confidence in their ability to maintain relationships while being authentic rather than constantly accommodating others. Recovery from dire necessity for approval involves developing what psychologists call self-acceptance, the ability to value oneself independent of others' opinions while still appreciating approval when it is available. This includes learning to distinguish between healthy social connection and desperate approval seeking, developing internal standards for self-worth, and building tolerance for normal amounts of social rejection. Practical strategies for managing dire necessity for approval include practicing approval independence exercises where individuals make decisions based on their own values rather than others. Expected reactions, developing rejection tolerance skills where they gradually expose themselves to small amounts of disapproval, and using internal validation techniques where they practice appreciating themselves regardless of others' opinions. Many people find it helpful to ask themselves, what would I do if I were trying to gain approval? And how would I advise a friend in this situation? 18. Abandonment or instability schema represents a cognitive distortion where individuals hold deep-seated beliefs that significant others will inevitably leave, die, or prove unreliable, leading to desperate attempts to prevent abandonment and chronic anxiety about relationship stability. This thinking pattern involves viewing relationships through a lens of inevitable loss and betrayal, creating intense fear of being alone and desperate behaviors to maintain connections. The schema treats abandonment as not just possible, but inevitable, making it difficult to form secure, trusting relationships. The psychological origins of abandonment instability schema typically develop from early experiences with actual abandonment, loss, or inconsistent caregiving. Children who experience parental death, divorce, emotional unavailability, or frequent disruptions in care may develop beliefs that relationships are inherently unstable and that they are fundamentally unworthy of consistent love and support. Additionally, individuals who have experienced multiple relationship losses or betrayals may develop this schema as a way to protect themselves from future hurt. Abandonment instability schema manifests in various ways across different relationship contexts. In romantic relationships, someone might constantly seek reassurance about their partner's commitment, interpret normal independence as signs of impending abandonment, or engage in clinging behaviors that actually push partners away. In friendships, they might avoid deep connections to prevent potential hurt, or constantly test friends' loyalty through demanding behaviors. In family relationships, they might become overly dependent on family members, or, conversely, distance themselves to avoid the pain of potential loss. The emotional consequences of abandonment instability schema are intense and persistent. This distortion creates chronic anxiety about relationship security and constant fear of being left alone. It generates feelings of desperation and panic when relationships are threatened, leading to emotional volatility and difficulty regulating responses to normal relationship challenges. The constant vigilance for signs of abandonment is exhausting and interferes with the ability to enjoy and appreciate current relationships. Behaviorally, abandonment instability schema often leads to paradoxical patterns where individuals engage in behaviors that increase the likelihood of the very abandonment they fear. They might become overly clingy, jealous, or demanding, testing partners' patience and commitment. Alternatively, they might engage in preemptive abandonment, leaving relationships before they can be left, or maintain emotional distance to avoid the pain of potential loss. The cognitive mechanisms underlying abandonment instability schema involve several psychological processes. Confirmation bias leads individuals to notice and remember evidence that supports their beliefs about relationship instability while ignoring evidence of commitment and reliability. Hypervigilance creates constant scanning for signs of potential abandonment, making normal relationship fluctuations feel threatening. Projection attributes their own fears and insecurities to others, assuming partners are as uncommitted as they feel. Neurobiologically, abandonment instability schema appears to involve dysregulation in brain regions associated with attachment and threat detection. The amygdala may be hyperreactive to signs of potential relationship threats, creating intense emotional responses to normal relationship dynamics. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for social conflicts and rejection, may be overactive. The attachment system may be chronically activated, creating desperate needs for connection while simultaneously fearing it. Treatment approaches for abandonment instability schema focus on helping individuals develop more secure attachment patterns and realistic expectations about relationship stability. Schema therapy is specifically designed to address these deep-rooted patterns through techniques that heal early attachment wounds and develop healthier relationship expectations. Therapists might use historical analysis to help clients understand how their early experiences shaped their current relationship fears. Emotionally focused therapy can be particularly effective for abandonment instability schema, as it helps individuals understand and express their attachment needs in healthy ways while building more secure connections with others. This includes learning to communicate fears and needs without pushing others away. Recovery from abandonment instability schema involves developing what psychologists call earned security, the ability to form stable, trusting relationships despite early attachment difficulties. This includes learning to tolerate normal relationship uncertainty, developing realistic expectations about human reliability, and building confidence in one's ability to cope with relationship challenges. Practical strategies for managing abandonment instability schema include practicing relationship reality testing, where individuals examine evidence for and against their fears of abandonment, developing security building behaviors that strengthen rather than threaten relationships, and using attachment communication skills where they express needs and fears in ways that invite support rather than distance. Many people find it helpful to create relationship security reminders that document evidence of others' commitment and reliability. 19. Defectiveness shame schema represents a cognitive distortion where individuals hold deep-seated beliefs that they are fundamentally flawed, defective, unwanted, or inferior in important ways that make them unlovable and unworthy of acceptance. This thinking pattern involves viewing oneself through a lens of inherent inadequacy and shame, creating chronic feelings of being not good enough and hypersensitivity to criticism or rejection. The schema treats personal flaws as evidence of fundamental unworthiness rather than normal human imperfections. The psychological origins of defectiveness shame schema typically develop from early experiences with harsh criticism, emotional abuse, rejection, or comparison to others. Children who grow up with caregivers who are consistently critical, dismissive, or who communicate that the child is disappointing or inadequate may internalize these messages as core beliefs about their worth. Additionally, experiences of bullying, social rejection, or being unfavorably compared to siblings or peers can contribute to the development of this schema. Defectiveness shame schema manifests in various ways across different life contexts. In relationships, someone might constantly worry that others will discover their true inadequate self and reject them, leading to either excessive people-pleasing or defensive isolation. In work settings, they might attribute successes to luck while viewing failures as confirmation of their incompetence. In social situations, they might feel like imposters who don't belong, constantly monitoring others' reactions for signs of rejection or judgment. The emotional consequences of defectiveness shame schema are profound and persistent. This distortion creates chronic feelings of shame, inadequacy, and self-hatred that color all aspects of life experience. It generates anxiety about being found out or exposed as inadequate, leading to constant self-monitoring and performance anxiety. The deep sense of being fundamentally flawed creates depression, hopelessness, and a belief that positive change is impossible. Behaviorally, defectiveness shame schema often leads to either compensatory behaviors, where individuals overachieve to prove their worth, or avoidance behaviors, where they withdraw from opportunities to prevent potential confirmation of their inadequacy. They might engage in perfectionism, workaholism, or people-pleasing to compensate for their perceived defectiveness. Or alternatively, they might avoid challenges, relationships, or opportunities where their flaws might be exposed. The cognitive mechanisms underlying defectiveness shame schema involve several psychological processes. Selective attention focuses on information that confirms beliefs about personal inadequacy, while filtering out evidence of competence and worth. Memory bias enhances recall of criticism and failures, while suppressing memories of successes and positive feedback. Interpretation bias leads to viewing neutral events as evidence of personal flaws and inadequacy. Neurobiologically, defectiveness shame schema appears to involve dysregulation in brain regions associated with self-evaluation and emotional processing. The anterior cingulate cortex may be overactive in monitoring for evidence of personal inadequacy, while the prefrontal cortex may be impaired in its ability to provide balanced self-assessment. The default mode network may be dominated by negative self-referential thinking, creating chronic rumination about personal flaws. Treatment approaches for defectiveness shame schema focus on helping individuals develop more compassionate and realistic self-concepts. Schema therapy is specifically designed to address these deep-rooted patterns through techniques that challenge core beliefs about personal inadequacy and develop healthier self-schemas. Therapists might use schema modification techniques, where clients explore evidence for and against their beliefs about being fundamentally flawed. Compassion-focused therapy can be particularly effective for defectiveness shame schema, as it specifically addresses shame and self-criticism through the development of self-compassion skills. This includes learning to treat oneself with the same kindness and understanding that would be offered to a loved one facing similar challenges. Recovery from defectiveness shame schema involves developing what psychologists call self-compassion and realistic self-acceptance, the ability to acknowledge personal flaws and limitations while maintaining a fundamentally positive and accepting relationship with oneself. This includes learning to view mistakes and imperfections as part of normal human experience, rather than evidence of fundamental inadequacy. Practical strategies for managing defectiveness shame schema include practicing self-compassion exercises, where individuals treat themselves with kindness during difficult times, developing realistic self-assessment skills, where they acknowledge both strengths and weaknesses without catastrophizing, and using shame resilience techniques, where they learn to recognize and respond to shame in healthy ways. Many people find it helpful to create self-worth evidence files that document their positive qualities, achievements, and contributions to others' lives. 20. Retroflexion represents a cognitive and behavioral distortion where individuals turn impulses, emotions, or needs that are meant for others back onto themselves, typically in harmful or counterproductive ways. This thinking pattern involves redirecting outward-directed energy inward, such as turning anger at others into self-criticism, transforming needs for support into self-reliance demands, or converting assertive impulses into passive submission. Retroflexion creates a disconnection from authentic emotional expression and interpersonal needs. The psychological origins of retroflexion often develop from early experiences where direct expression of emotions or needs was dangerous, discouraged, or punished. Children who grow up in environments where anger is forbidden, sadness is dismissed, or needs are met with rejection may learn to turn these natural responses inward rather than risk external consequences. Additionally, individuals from cultures that emphasize self-control, emotional restraint, or self-sacrifice may be more prone to retroflexion as a socially acceptable way to manage difficult emotions. Retroflexion manifests in various ways across different emotional and interpersonal contexts. Someone might turn anger at a boss into self-criticism about their own work performance, transform sadness about a relationship ending into self-blame for being too needy, or convert assertiveness needs into harsh self-demands for independence. In conflict situations, they might blame themselves for others' behavior rather than addressing the actual source of the problem. The emotional consequences of retroflexion are significant and self-destructive. This distortion creates chronic self-criticism, guilt, and shame as emotions that should be directed outward become internalized attacks on the self. It generates depression and anxiety as natural emotional responses are turned into self-punishment. The inability to express emotions and needs appropriately leads to emotional accumulation and eventual explosive outbursts or complete emotional shutdown. Behaviorally, retroflexion often leads to self-sabotage, self-harm, or passive-aggressive patterns where individuals punish themselves instead of addressing interpersonal problems directly. They might engage in self-criticism instead of setting boundaries, take on excessive responsibility for others' problems, or withdraw from relationships instead of expressing their needs and concerns. The cognitive mechanisms underlying retroflexion involve several psychological processes. Emotional misdirection occurs where feelings are redirected from their appropriate targets to inappropriate ones. Responsibility distortion leads individuals to take blame for others' actions or problems. Conflict avoidance creates preferences for internal struggle over external confrontation. Additionally, there's often confusion between self-responsibility and self-blame. Neurobiologically, retroflexion appears to involve dysregulation in brain regions associated with emotional processing and social cognition. The prefrontal cortex may be overactive in suppressing natural emotional responses, while the limbic system may be underactive in processing emotions appropriately. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for conflicts, may be misdirected toward internal rather than external conflicts. Treatment approaches for retroflexion focus on helping individuals recognize when they are returning emotions inward and learn to express them more appropriately. Gestalt therapy specifically addresses retroflexion through techniques that help clients identify and redirect misdirected emotions and needs. Therapists might use empty chair exercises where clients practice expressing feelings to their intended targets rather than turning them inward. Assertiveness training can be particularly effective for retroflexion, as it helps individuals learn to express their needs and feelings directly, rather than turning them inward as self-criticism or self-blame. This includes learning to recognize the difference between appropriate self-responsibility and inappropriate self-blame. Recovery from retroflexion involves developing what psychologists call emotional directness, the ability to identify the appropriate targets for emotions and needs and express them in healthy ways. This includes learning to distinguish between internal and external sources of problems, developing skills for appropriate emotional expression, and building confidence in one's right to have and express feelings and needs. Practical strategies for managing retroflexion include practicing emotion tracking, where individuals identify what they are feeling and toward whom. Developing expression experiments, where they practice directing emotions outward appropriately. And using responsibility clarification techniques, where they distinguish between their responsibilities and others. Many people find it helpful to ask themselves, who or what am I really angry, sad, disappointed about? And what would happen if I expressed this feeling to its intended target? 21. Conditions of worth represent a cognitive distortion where individuals believe their self-worth and value as a person depend on meeting specific standards, achievements, or external expectations rather than having inherent value as human beings. This thinking pattern involves conditional self-acceptance, where personal worth fluctuates based on performance, approval, or meeting particular criteria, creating chronic anxiety about maintaining worthiness and fear of falling short of standards. The psychological origins of conditions of worth typically develop from early experiences with conditional love and acceptance. where children learn that they are valued only when they meet certain expectations or behave in specific ways. Children who grow up in environments where approval, affection, or acceptance are contingent upon achievement, compliance, or meeting parental expectations may internalize these external conditions as internal requirements for self-worth. Additionally, cultural and social messages about success, achievement, and acceptable behavior can contribute to the development of conditional self-worth. Conditions of worth manifest in various ways across different life domains. In academic or professional settings, someone might base their entire self-worth on grades, job performance, or career advancement, feeling worthless when they don't meet these standards. In relationships, they might believe they're only lovable when they're helpful, attractive, or accommodating to others' needs. In personal development, they might tie their worth to maintaining certain behaviors, achievements, or personal qualities. The emotional consequences of conditions of worth are profound and exhausting. This distortion creates chronic anxiety about maintaining worthiness and constant fear of falling short of standards. It generates feelings of inadequacy and self-criticism when conditions aren't met, leading to emotional volatility based on external circumstances rather than stable self-acceptance. The constant effort required to maintain worthiness is exhausting and interferes with authentic self-expression and personal growth. Behaviorally, conditions of worth often lead to perfectionism, people-pleasing, or achievement-focused behaviors where individuals exhaust themselves trying to meet the conditions they believe are necessary for their worth. They might overwork to prove their value, avoid challenges where they might fail, or sacrifice their own needs to maintain others' approval. This pattern often creates a treadmill effect where achieving one condition only creates pressure to achieve the next. The cognitive mechanisms underlying conditions of worth involve several psychological processes. Conditional thinking creates if-then beliefs about self-worth, where value depends on meeting specific criteria. External locus of evaluation places the source of self-worth outside of oneself in achievements, approval, or performance. Perfectionism creates impossibly high standards that must be met to maintain worthiness. Additionally, there's often confusion between self-worth and self-esteem, where temporary feelings about performance are treated as permanent truths about personal value. Neurobiologically, conditions of worth appear to involve dysregulation in brain regions associated with self-evaluation and reward processing. The anterior cingulate cortex may be overactive in monitoring for evidence of worthiness or unworthiness, while the prefrontal cortex may be impaired in its ability to provide stable self-acceptance. The brain's reward systems may become dependent on external validation and achievement, making conditional worth feel necessary for psychological well-being. Treatment approaches for conditions of worth focus on helping individuals develop unconditional self-acceptance and recognize their inherent worth as human beings. Person-centered therapy specifically addresses conditions of worth through techniques that help clients reconnect with their authentic selves and develop unconditional positive self-regard. Therapists might use worth exploration exercises where clients examine the source of their self-worth beliefs and consider alternative ways of valuing themselves. Self-compassion training can be particularly effective for conditions of worth, as it helps individuals develop a kind and accepting relationship with themselves that doesn't depend on meeting external standards. This includes learning to treat oneself with compassion during failures and setbacks rather than withdrawal of self-worth. Recovery from conditions of worth involves developing what psychologists call unconditional self-acceptance, the ability to value oneself as a human being regardless of performance, achievement, or external approval. This includes learning to distinguish between healthy standards and self-worth conditions, developing internal sources of validation, and building confidence in one's inherent value. Practical strategies for managing conditions of worth include practicing unconditional self-acceptance, exercises where individuals affirm their worth regardless of performance, developing internal validation skills where they learn to appreciate themselves independent of external feedback, and using worth separation techniques where they distinguish between their actions and their fundamental value as a person. Many people find it helpful to ask themselves, what would I be worth if I could and do anything to earn it? And how would I treat a friend who is struggling with the same standards? 22. Problem-saturated narratives represent a cognitive distortion where individuals organize their life stories around problems, failures, and negative experiences while ignoring or minimizing strengths, resources, and positive exceptions. This thinking pattern involves creating a personal narrative that is dominated by difficulties and deficits, making it difficult to recognize competencies, successes, and possibilities for positive change. The life story becomes a catalog of problems rather than a balanced account of both challenges and resources. The psychological origins of problem-saturated narratives often develop from experiences with mental health systems, family dynamics, or social environments that focus heavily on problems and pathology rather than strengths and possibilities. Individuals who have been repeatedly asked to identify problems, deficits, or symptoms may internalize this problem-focused perspective as their primary identity. Additionally, those who have experienced significant trauma, loss, or chronic difficulties may develop problem-saturated narratives as a way to make sense of their experiences. Problem-saturated narratives manifest in various ways across different life contexts. Someone might describe themselves primarily in terms of their mental health diagnosis, relationship failures, or career disappointments, while rarely mentioning their achievements, skills, or positive relationships. In therapy or support settings, they might focus exclusively on problems and symptoms while being unable to identify strengths or resources. In social situations, they might consistently present themselves as struggling or failing, rather than sharing balanced perspectives on their experiences. The emotional consequences of problem-saturated narratives are significant and self-perpetuating. This distortion creates chronic feelings of hopelessness and helplessness as individuals see themselves primarily as collections of problems rather than whole people with both challenges and strengths. It generates identity confusion and low self-esteem as positive aspects of identity are ignored or minimized. The focus on problems often creates a sense of being stuck or unable to change, as resources and capabilities are not recognized or utilized. Behaviorally, problem-saturated narratives often lead to self-limiting behaviors where individuals do and pursue opportunities or goals because they see themselves as fundamentally flawed or incapable. They might avoid challenges because their narrative doesn't include stories of competence or resilience, or they might consistently present themselves as victims rather than agents of change in their own lives. The cognitive mechanisms underlying problem-saturated narratives involve several psychological processes. Selective attention focuses on information that confirms the problem-focused identity while filtering out evidence of competence and success. Memory bias enhances recall of difficulties and failures while suppressing memories of achievements and strengths. Confirmation bias leads to seeking out and noticing information that supports the problem-saturated narrative while ignoring contradictory evidence. Neurobiologically, problem-saturated narratives appear to involve dysregulation in brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and memory formation. The default mode network may be dominated by negative self-referential thinking, creating chronic rumination about problems and deficits. The hippocampus may be biased toward encoding and retrieving problem-focused memories, while positive experiences are poorly consolidated or recalled. Treatment approaches for problem-saturated narratives focus on helping individuals develop more balanced and strength-focused life stories. Narrative therapy specifically addresses problem-saturated narratives through techniques that help clients externalize problems and identify unique outcomes where they demonstrated competence and agency. Therapists might use re-authoring exercises where clients explore alternative stories about their lives that include both challenges and strengths. Solution-focused therapy can be particularly effective for problem-saturated narratives, as it helps individuals identify times when problems were less prominent or when they demonstrated resilience and competence. This includes exploring exceptions to problem stories and building upon existing strengths and resources. Recovery from problem-saturated narratives involves developing what psychologists call balanced life stories, the ability to acknowledge both challenges and strengths while maintaining a sense of agency and possibility for positive change. This includes learning to recognize and articulate competencies, to identify resources and support systems, and to maintain hope for future growth and development. Practical strategies for managing problem-saturated narratives include practicing strength identification exercises where individuals systematically explore their competencies and achievements, developing balanced storytelling skills where they learn to include both challenges and resources in their narratives, and using exception exploration techniques where they identify times when problems were less prominent or when they demonstrated resilience. Many people find it helpful to create strength portfolios that document their capabilities, achievements, and positive qualities. 23. Solution blindness represents a cognitive distortion where individuals fail to recognize existing resources, past successes, or times when problems were less severe or absent entirely, creating a perception that current difficulties are permanent, unsolvable, and unprecedented. This thinking pattern involves a selective focus on problems while remaining blind to evidence of capability, resilience, and times when things worked well. Solution blindness creates feelings of helplessness and hopelessness by ignoring the very resources and strategies that could help address current challenges. The psychological origins of solution blindness often develop from prolonged exposure to problems, stress, or mental health difficulties that create tunnel vision focused on what isn't working rather than what is working. Individuals who have experienced chronic depression, anxiety, or trauma may develop this distortion, as their emotional states bias their perception toward problems and away from solutions. Additionally, cultural and social environments that emphasize problem identification over solution finding can contribute to the development of solution blindness. Solution blindness manifests in various ways across different life contexts. Someone might insist that they've never been good at relationships while ignoring evidence of successful friendships or family connections. In work settings, they might claim they're always failing while overlooking times when they've performed well or overcome challenges. In personal growth contexts, they might believe they're stuck or never change while failing to recognize gradual improvements or past instances of successful adaptation. The emotional consequences of solution blindness are significant and discouraging. This distortion creates feelings of helplessness and hopelessness as individuals believe they lack the resources or capabilities to address their problems. It generates frustration and despair as current difficulties seem insurmountable and unprecedented. The inability to recognize existing strengths and past successes prevents the development of confidence and resilience that could help address current challenges. Behaviorally, solution blindness often leads to giving up on goals, avoiding challenges, or repeatedly trying strategies that don't work while ignoring approaches that have been successful in the past. Someone might seek entirely new solutions to problems while being unable to recognize and build upon strategies that have worked before. This pattern often creates a sense of starting over repeatedly rather than building upon existing foundations. The cognitive mechanisms underlying solution blindness involve several psychological processes. Selective attention focuses on problems and failures while filtering out evidence of success and competence. Memory bias enhances recall of difficulties while suppressing memories of times when things worked well. Confirmation bias leads to seeking out information that confirms beliefs about being stuck or helpless, while ignoring evidence of capability and past success. Neurobiologically, solution blindness appears to involve dysregulation in brain regions associated with memory retrieval and pattern recognition. The hippocampus may be biased toward retrieving problem-focused memories, while positive experiences and successful strategies are poorly accessed. The prefrontal cortex may be impaired in its ability to recognize patterns of success and apply past learning to current situations. Treatment approaches for solution blindness focus on helping individuals recognize and build upon existing strengths, resources, and past successes. Solution-focused therapy specifically addresses solution blindness through techniques that help clients identify exceptions to problems and explore times when they've demonstrated competence and resilience. Therapists might use miracle questions, where clients imagine solutions and then work backward to identify existing resources that could help achieve those outcomes. Strength-based approaches can be particularly effective for solution blindness, as they systematically help individuals identify and articulate their capabilities, achievements, and resources. This includes exploring support systems, coping strategies, and past instances of successful problem-solving. Recovery from solution blindness involves developing what psychologists call resource awareness, the ability to recognize and utilize existing strengths, past successes, and available resources when facing current challenges. This includes learning to identify patterns of success, to build upon past achievements, and to recognize that current difficulties may be temporary rather than permanent. Practical strategies for managing solution blindness include practicing exception identification exercises, where individuals explore times when problems were less prominent or absent, developing resource mapping skills, where they systematically identify available supports and capabilities, and using success archaeology techniques, where they explore past instances of effective problem-solving. Many people find it helpful to create solution portfolios that document their successful strategies, resources, and past achievements. 24. Rumination loops represent a cognitive distortion where individuals engage in repetitive, analytical thinking about problems, concerns, or negative experiences without reaching resolution or taking constructive action. This thinking pattern involves getting stuck in cycles of mental rehearsal about difficulties, constantly analyzing problems from different angles without making progress toward solutions. Rumination loops create the illusion of productive problem-solving while actually increasing distress and interfering with effective coping. The psychological origins of rumination loops often develop from beliefs that thorough analysis and mental preparation can prevent problems or ensure perfect solutions. Individuals who have been taught that thinking harder about problems will solve them, or who have anxiety about making mistakes, may develop rumination as a misguided coping strategy. Additionally, those with depression, anxiety, or perfectionistic tendencies may be more prone to rumination, as their emotional states make it difficult to disengage from negative thinking patterns. Rumination loops manifest in various ways across different life contexts. Someone might repeatedly replay a social interaction, analyzing every detail and imagining different outcomes without ever reaching a conclusion or taking action. In work settings, they might continuously worry about potential problems or mistakes without engaging in productive problem solving. In relationships, they might endlessly analyze conflicts or concerns without communicating with their partner or making decisions about how to proceed. The emotional consequences of rumination loops are significant and exhausting. This distortion creates chronic anxiety and depression as individuals become trapped in cycles of negative thinking without relief or resolution. It generates feelings of helplessness and frustration as extensive mental effort fails to produce solutions or peace of mind. The repetitive nature of rumination often amplifies negative emotions, making problems feel larger and more overwhelming than they actually are. The mental energy devoted to rumination is exhausting and interferes with the ability to engage fully in present-moment experiences. Behaviorally, rumination loops often lead to avoidance, procrastination, or paralysis as individuals become so absorbed in thinking about problems that they fail to take constructive action. They might delay making decisions because they're stuck analyzing all possible outcomes, avoid activities because they're preoccupied with negative thoughts, or neglect self-care because their mental resources are consumed by repetitive thinking. This pattern often creates a vicious cycle where inaction generates more problems to ruminate about. The cognitive mechanisms underlying rumination loops involve several psychological processes. Perseverative thinking creates difficulty disengaging from negative thoughts and concerns. Problem-solving confusion treats repetitive thinking as productive analysis rather than recognizing it as unproductive mental spinning. Attention bias focuses mental resources on problems and concerns while neglecting positive or neutral aspects of experience. Additionally, there's often a belief that thinking harder about problems will eventually lead to solutions, even when this approach has repeatedly failed. Neurobiologically, rumination loops appear to involve overactivation of the brain's default mode network, particularly regions associated with self-referential thinking and problem-solving. The anterior cingulate cortex may be overactive in monitoring for problems and conflicts, while the prefrontal cortex may be impaired in its ability to shift attention away from negative thoughts. The brain's executive control systems may be overwhelmed by the persistent negative thinking, making it difficult to disengage from rumination voluntarily. Treatment approaches for rumination loops focus on helping individuals recognize when they're re-engaging in unproductive repetitive thinking and develop strategies to break these cycles. Cognitive behavioral therapy employs techniques such as thought stopping, where clients learn to interrupt rumination cycles, scheduling worry time, where rumination is contained to specific periods, and action planning, where thinking is redirected toward constructive problem solving. Mindfulness-based interventions are particularly effective for rumination loops, as they help individuals develop awareness of their thinking patterns and the ability to observe thoughts without being caught up in them. Through mindfulness practice, people learn to recognize when they're ruminating and can consciously redirect their attention to present moment experiences. Recovery from rumination loops involves developing what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to disengage from unproductive thinking patterns and redirect attention toward more helpful activities. This includes learning to distinguish between productive problem solving and unproductive rumination, developing skills for managing intrusive thoughts, and building capacity for present moment awareness. Practical strategies for managing rumination loops include practicing rumination awareness, exercises where individuals learn to recognize when they restuck in repetitive thinking, developing attention redirection skills where they consciously shift focus to present moment activities, and using action orientation techniques where they channel mental energy toward constructive behaviors rather than endless analysis. Many people find it helpful to ask themselves, is this thinking helping me solve the problem or just making me feel worse? And what action could I take right now instead of continuing to think about this? 25. Frustration intolerance represents a cognitive distortion where individuals believe it is catastrophic, unbearable, or absolutely unacceptable when things don't go according to plan, leading to extreme emotional reactions to normal life challenges and setbacks. This thinking pattern involves treating temporary discomfort, inconvenience, or disappointment as intolerable disasters that require immediate resolution or avoidance. Frustration intolerance transforms ordinary difficulties into overwhelming crises that feel impossible to endure. The psychological origins of frustration intolerance often develop from early experiences with overprotective parenting, immediate gratification of needs, or environments where children were shielded from normal frustrations and challenges. Children who grow up without learning to tolerate delay, disappointment, or discomfort may develop beliefs that such experiences are unbearable and must be avoided at all costs. Additionally, individuals with certain temperamental characteristics, such as high sensitivity or impulsivity, may be more prone to frustration intolerance, as their nervous systems are more reactive to stress and discomfort. Frustration intolerance manifests in various ways across different life contexts. Someone might have explosive reactions to minor inconveniences like traffic delays or slow internet, treating these situations as unbearable disasters rather than temporary annoyances. In work settings, they might become overwhelmed by normal workplace challenges, demanding immediate solutions, or becoming extremely distressed when things don't proceed smoothly. In relationships, they might react with extreme anger or withdrawal when partners don't meet their expectations, or when conflicts arise. The emotional consequences of frustration intolerance are intense and disruptive. This distortion creates chronic stress and anxiety as individuals live in constant fear of encountering frustrating situations. It generates anger, irritability, and emotional volatility as normal life challenges are experienced as overwhelming threats. The inability to tolerate frustration often leads to impulsive behaviors and poor decision-making as individuals desperately seek to escape or avoid uncomfortable situations. Behaviorally, frustration intolerance often leads to avoidance patterns where individuals limit their activities to prevent potential frustration, or to explosive reactions when frustrating situations cannot be avoided. They might quit jobs, end relationships, or abandon goals when faced with normal challenges and setbacks. This pattern often creates a cycle where avoidance of frustration leads to increased sensitivity to it, making individuals even less capable of handling normal difficulties. The cognitive mechanisms underlying frustration intolerance involve several psychological processes. Catastrophic thinking treats minor frustrations as major disasters requiring immediate resolution. Low frustration tolerance creates beliefs that discomfort is unbearable and must be eliminated immediately. Emotional reasoning treats the intensity of frustration as evidence that the situation is actually unbearable. Additionally, there's often confusion between discomfort and danger, where unpleasant experiences are treated as genuine threats. Neurobiologically, frustration intolerance appears to involve dysregulation in brain regions associated with emotional regulation and impulse control. The amygdala may be hyperreactive to frustrating stimuli, creating intense emotional responses to minor challenges. The prefrontal cortex may be impaired in its ability to regulate emotional responses and maintain perspective on temporary difficulties. The anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for conflicts and problems, may be overactive in responding to frustrating situations. Treatment approaches for frustration intolerance focus on helping individuals develop greater tolerance for discomfort and more realistic expectations about life's challenges. Rational emotive behavior therapy specifically addresses frustration intolerance through techniques that help clients distinguish between inconvenience and catastrophe. Therapists might use frustration tolerance building exercises where clients gradually expose themselves to minor frustrations to build their capacity for discomfort. Distress tolerance skills from dialectical behavior therapy can be particularly effective for frustration intolerance, as they teach specific techniques for managing intense emotions and tolerating distressing situations without making them worse through impulsive actions. Recovery from frustration intolerance involves developing what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to experience temporary discomfort, disappointment, and frustration without catastrophizing or engaging in destructive behaviors. This includes learning to view frustration as a temporary and manageable experience rather than an unbearable disaster, developing realistic expectations about life's challenges, and building confidence in one's ability to cope with difficulties. Practical strategies for managing frustration intolerance include practicing frustration reframing, exercises where individuals learn to view challenges as temporary inconveniences rather than disasters, developing distress tolerance skills where they learn to ride out uncomfortable emotions without reacting impulsively, and using perspective-taking techniques where they consider how current frustrations might seem in broader contexts. Many people find it helpful to create frustration tolerance ladders, where they gradually expose themselves to increasing levels of frustration to build their capacity for discomfort.